In this video, you will learn about some of the top tips for how to learn most effectively and efficiently. Because who wants to waste their time while they're studying? Some questions that we'll answer. What are effective study methods? Why memorize when I can just look it up? And how can I study using retrieval practice, space learning, and elaborative encoding? So, I want to start with a question about what are some effective study methods? Of the three listed here, which do you think are considered effective study methods? Go ahead and pause the video if you need to think about this, but make a decision before you continue. So, it turns out that none of these are considered very effective study methods, even though these three are some of the most common study methods used by students. So, what are some effective study methods? Three that we will focus on are retrieval practice, space learning, and elaborative encoding. And I have another question for you. If you had to choose between these two options, which do you think is the better study technique? To reread the notes or the text, or to try and remember what's in the notes or the text? So, as you might have guessed by now, the second one, trying to remember, has a much bigger effect on what we can remember later than rereading. Trying to remember what has been learned is referred to as retrieval practice. It is essentially practice retrieving something from memory. Its benefit for memory over rereading is one of the most heavily researched and supported findings in the science of learning literature. So it is an important one to be aware of. Flashcards are a common form of research practice that students engage in. If you've never used flashcards before, typically there is a term or a question on one side of the card, and students attempt to define the term or answer the question on the other side before checking their answer on the other side. So, in addition to being an effective way for students to assess themselves, how well they have learned something, it also engages them in retrieval practice, further strengthening their memory. Retrieval practice comes by way of a research finding called the testing effect. Interestingly, taking a test helps you better learn what you are being tested on. Later, you will better remember what you were tested on than something that you just reread. And it's believed that retrieval practice is the mechanism that underlies the testing effect. Because what do you do when you try to answer a test question? You retrieve what you have in memory, right? So, retrieval practice is kind of like working a muscle. Practice remembering strengthens the ability to remember in the future. And one way that retrieval practice helps when it comes time to use that information is that it occupies less room in something called working memory when it is already known versus when it needs to be looked up. So let's talk a little bit more about what this means. And it starts with this question: why memorize when you can just look something up? Why bother with that effort of getting the information into your head when it's freely available in your textbook, on the internet, through generative AI? Why do you think? Go ahead and pause the video for a moment to reflect on this question. So let's look into this. To answer the question, we need to talk about two different types of memory. We have working memory and long-term memory. Working memory is essentially whatever you are thinking about at the moment, whatever you are holding in mind, whereas long-term memory is our permanent memory storage. So, for example, if I were to give you a phone number to remember, and you had to say it to yourself in your head to hang on to it until you had a chance to write it down or type it into your phone, that is using your working memory. However, if I ask you for your childhood phone number, that is something you have stored in long-term memory. It's there even when you're not thinking about it, and you can draw from it whenever you need to and pull it into working memory. As soon as you are thinking about that childhood phone number, you are moving it from long-term memory into working memory. Now, let's talk about capacity. The capacity of long-term memory is limitless. As far as we know, we can never fill it up. that is not true of working memory. Working memory capacity is severely limited, and it can become full quite easily. If we fill up working memory, as soon as we add something new to it, something else is dropped. It's kind of like juggling. You can only juggle so many balls at one time, and if you add a new one, another one is likely to get dropped. When studying or learning something new, you can only have so many pieces of information in your working memory at any one time. So, why the capacity of working memory matters is as soon as you want to do any sort of advanced thinking work with what you know, that too takes up space in working memory. So, if the information you are dealing with involves principles of a theory and you are asked how that theory might apply to a problem, that additional thinking work also takes up working memory capacity. The problem comes when the information we need to solve the problem takes up too much working memory capacity and doesn't leave enough capacity for that thinking work. So, if the information we need comes from outside of our head, such as in our textbook, that's going to take up much more working memory capacity and leave little room for thinking work than if that information is already in our heads, in our long term memory. When we already know the information well, it takes up less working memory capacity, leaving more capacity for that higher level thinking work. So, how would you answer this question now? Go ahead and pause the video one more time to reflect on the answer. So, hopefully, you are starting to realize looking information up is very resource heavy for our brains. And if we have to look up everything, there is very little advanced thinking work that we can do with that information. Retrieval practice is the best way to get that information into our heads. So, how can you study using retrieval practice? There are countless ways to engage in retrieval practice. We will look at 6 of them. One is practice tests. Testing yourself, or if your instructor provides you with practice tests, is a great way to engage in retrieval practice, as mentioned before. 2, flashcards, also mentioned before. The key with flashcards, though, is to try and remember what is on the other side of the card before you turn it over. Brain dumps are something that you can do right after a lecture or completing a reading. You can do it at the end or after a certain chunk. And all it is where you pause for a moment and you write down everything you can remember that you just learned about. And 4 is a twist to brain dumps called pre-new learning brain dumps. This is where, before you read the next chapter or head to the next lecture, you try to remember everything you learned in the previous chapter or lecture. This is great because it spaces out your retrieval practice, incorporating space learning, which we will talk about next. And we also know from research that if you activate relevant knowledge that you already know about before learning new material, you will learn that new material better. 5 main points is a variant of a brain dump, where rather than writing down everything you can remember, you're a little more selective and you try to focus on 3 or so of the most important main points of the reading or the lecture. And 6, tell a friend. You don't have to engage in retrieval practice or write it down. Find a buddy and explain what you know. Plus, learning with others can give an additional boost to learning. All right, let's pause for a moment and do a retrieval practice brain dump on retrieval practice. Pause this video, find a piece of paper and a pen, and write down everything you can remember that you have learned so far. All right, another question for you. Is it better for learning to study for a focused 90 minutes or 30 minutes across 3 different days? What do you think? So, again, here, the correct answer is the second one, 30 minutes spread across 3 separate days. And this is referred to as spaced learning. Something magical happens when learning is spread across time, even when no additional time is spent studying the information. So, for example, we have Nora at the bottom who has spent 4 hours cramming for the next exam, all in one sitting. She will receive the lowest grade. Leanne broke up her studying across 4 different sessions, 1 hour each, so didn't spend any additional time. But because she broke up her studying, she's going to earn a higher grade. And then we have Leslie. Leslie has broken up her studying even more and will receive the highest grade of them all. And do note that even though Leslie has many more study sessions than Leanne or Nora, Leslie's study sessions are only a half hour. So if you incorporate additional study sessions, note that they can be shorter. You don't have to cover everything in a single study session. Break it up. And most of us have heard that cramming the night before an exam is not the best way to learn. Rather, it's best to be studying a little every few days, starting well before the exam. But why? Why is this beneficial for learning? Well, there are a few different reasons it is believed that spaced learning is beneficial for long term learning. One is that it creates opportunities for retrieval practice. Each new study session is an opportunity to reflect back on and remember what was previously learned. Further, spaced learning leads to more effective consolidation and organization. So, consolidation is just a fancy word for making memories more permanent. Spaced learning helps with this, as well as the organization of that information in your head. And a lot of this happens during sleep. So, the more opportunities for sleep in between study sessions, the more effective the learning. And interestingly, our brain performs some of this consolidation and organization even while we take a break. So, breaks are important for learning. And finally, new learning depends on prior learning. We can't make sense of new information without relating it to what we already know. That is how we make sense of something new. We use our pre existing knowledge to explain it. So, by spacing learning, subsequent learning episodes can benefit from what was consolidated and organized during earlier study episodes. I kind of think of spaced learning as like building a brick wall. The top layers are supported by the lower layers. Their integrity is dependent on the integrity or soundness of the lower layers. Likewise, new knowledge builds on and is dependent on the integrity or soundness of previous knowledge. Okay, how can you study using spaced learning? There are certain things that instructors can do to help space out what you learn, but in terms of what you can do, it's really just a matter of planning out your study sessions in advance and spacing them out. But spaced learning isn't just helpful for studying for an exam or an assessment. You can also use it for big assignments. Complete those big assignments in parts. Get started on it early, and when you revisit it later, you may have fresh new ideas to apply to your work. Okay, moving on. I want to try this depth of processing task with you guys. Step number 1 is to answer this question for each of these words. I want you to answer to yourself, does each word have an E or a G in it? So number 1, bicycle. Does that have an E or a G in it? What about number 2, orange? 3, mirror. 4, cloud. 5, guitar. Okay, let's try another one. In this case, I want you to answer the following question for each word. Would the word fit the sentence, he met a blank in the street? So 6, candle. 7, elephant. 8, jacket. 9, rocket. 10, sandwich. Now, write down all the words you can remember without looking back at them. Go ahead and pause the video while you do this. So, this task works better if there is a delay in between looking at the words and remembering them. But let's see how you did. All right, go ahead and check how you did. Did you remember more of the words on the left or the right? Chances are you remembered more of the words on the right because of something referred to as depth of processing or elaborative encoding. And what is encoding? So, to understand what depth of processing or elaborative encoding mean, it's helpful to understand how the process of encoding fits into learning and memory. Encoding is the initial processing of incoming information that eventually gets stored and that we can later retrieve. Elaborative encoding is when we more deeply process that incoming information in a meaningful way that relates to information we already have stored. When we process information more deeply and elaboratively in this way, it gets better stored and is easier to retrieve later. And you can see some evidence for elaborative encoding here. In this study, participants were given a similar task to the one I just asked you to engage with, but they had four different conditions. In the structural condition, participants were asked to judge whether the word was in uppercase or lowercase letters. So, just evaluating the visual characteristics of the word, not really thinking about what it is or what it means. In the phonemic task, participants were asked whether or not the word rhymed with another word that was provided. In this case, participants considered the sound of the word. In the semantic task, participants were asked if the word was a synonym of another word. In other words, really thinking about the meaning of the word, meaning that they can only derive from relating the word to knowledge they already have. And in an added condition, the self-reference condition, participants were asked whether or not the word was true of themselves, if it described them. And you can see this had a huge effect on memory. What is believed to have happened here is because this task depends on processing the meaning of the word based off of knowledge that you already have, because the knowledge we have about ourselves is much richer than knowledge we have about anything else. When we relate new information to ourselves, while semantic processing of information is like glue for learning, self-reference processing of new information is like super glue for new learning. So while it really pays to consider the meaning of what you are learning as you are learning it, if you can find a way to relate it to yourself and your life, maybe how you would use that information, that will really give your learning a boost. And just briefly here, how can you study using elaborative encoding? One is by always asking yourself as you're encountering new information, how and why questions. These sorts of questions really get you to make sense of what you are learning about given what you already know, and to reveal holes in understanding that you might not have otherwise noticed. This is similar to the technique of self-explanation, which is simply the act of explaining your understanding of what you are learning. And finally, telling a friend applies here as well, because by telling a friend what you know, you will have to explain it to them, probably answering how and why questions as you go. All right, hopefully now you feel confident in your ability to answer these questions that were posed at the beginning. What are effective study methods? Why memorize when you can just look it up? And how can you study using retrieval practice, space learning, and elaborative encoding?